Okay, so cognitive psychology is emerging and the human information processing paradigm is now on the scene. So, in this paradigm, which I think is being used kind of loosely because I don't know if we really have, the strength of a paradigm behind it. But in this perspective, when we are processing information, it is done in a serial fashion, according to this paradigm, the beginning of the field of cognitive psychology, that we process information in a serial fashion in stages that are linear. The more stages there are to process, the more time it's going to take to process the information. And that these stages consist of stage one, detecting the stimulus out in the environment, stage two, recognizing that stimulus, and then stage three, generating a response. So these are linear stages that have to be gone through in order, and we can put more stages in depending on what the information is and what's going on. The parallel human information processing theory says all this processes can begin at the same time. So if you have, let's say, detection, recognition, and response happening, you can begin them all simultaneously. But your finish time, how long it'll take you to accomplish the task, will be determined by the slowest processor. So maybe recognition is your slowest processor. So that's going to take you the longest amount of time, and that's when you'll be done with the task, even though detection, and maybe you even generated a response beforehand. A good example of how that could happen, you might be thinking, how would I do a response before I've even recognized what the stimulus is? Have you ever stepped on anything sharp? You have stepped on it and gotten your foot off of it before the information has made it up to your brain, and you've had the ability to go, holy cow, I think I just stepped on glass, or I stepped on a Lego, or whatever the recognition is, right? You responded, you got off of it beforehand. But the fact that the information has to continue on up to your brain, you have to figure out what that was. That's the slowest processor. So that's actually going to be the finish time. The cascade model says that all processes are going to begin simultaneously, and that the finish time is going to be determined by the last processor. But in the cascade model, you've got all of them starting processing at the same time, and then by definition, as you finish up one of the stages, all of the effort and energy and thought and all the resources that have been devoted to that first stage now can be devoted to the remaining stages. And then once the next fastest process is done, all of its effort and cognitions and stuff can be devoted to the next stages that are still being processed. And so with each remaining stage, you'll get a little faster because you're taking over effort that had been being devoted to stages that were being completed. You kind of see this in your computers. A lot of times if you've ever tried to, let's say, upload videos to YouTube or something, I oftentimes am uploading like 5 of them at the same time. It starts all of them at the same time, but as one of them gets uploaded because it was shorter or less dense or whatever, the remaining ones will actually now process faster than they had been doing when there had been, that first one still in process. That's a good example of a cascade model kind of description. I don't know if that's how it really works, but I just watch my stuff uploading and I see once one is up, the remaining ones start to go faster. And I always think to myself, oh, look, it uses a cascade method of processing information. I don't know if that's real or not, but as far as how YouTube works, but that's what it looks like. All right, one of the most important models that occurred in cognitive psychology was a model that described memory, and that's the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. In 1965, they developed a 3-stage model of memory. A lot of people call this the box model of memory because the theory says that information moves from one box to the next when you're moving it deeper into your memory and then also retrieving it. Now, in 1965, they were using then, quality computers as their model for how your mind works. So some of the stuff that is described in the Atkinson and Shiffrin model actually was well represented by computers probably until about the mid 80s. And then computers started to fix some of the errors that made them a good model for human memory, but the human memory has not been fixed. So it still works like the old computers did. The idea in the Atkinson and Shiffrin model is that you've got external events that impinge on your sensory organs. So this is sounding very much like everything we've talked about so far in this chapter, right? This idea that sensations are the important thing. So you've got these external events that land in your eyes, your ears, your nose, your skin, all the sense organs. Encoding is the paying attention to some subset of that information that has landed in your sensory organs. So you're going to pay attention to something, maybe something that you're hearing, and that'll cause you not to notice something that is coming in through your eyes or something like that. That's called encoding, where you're paying attention to some subset of the information, and you then transfer it, because you're paying attention to it, into your short-term memory. Now the model has been, it's very difficult to find an old version of what this model should have looked like. The phrase working memory is a more modern term. That shouldn't be there if we're just talking about Atkinson and Shiffrin. It should just say short-term memory. So when you pay attention to some subset, it transfers that information into the short-term memory. Now, if you continue to think about it, you continue to encode that information, it can move it to the next box, which is long-term memory. If you get it into long-term memory, it should be there permanently. And anytime you want to think about it, you have to retrieve it out of the long-term memory box, place it back into the short-term memory box, so now you can think about it. So that's the idea with the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. We will talk about this in more detail when we get to the chapter on memory. But just to show you how it relates to computers, you can think about the keyboard on your computer being like the first stage of encoding, where you're getting the information into RAM. Short-term memory would be like the RAM, whatever's appearing on your screen at the moment. And then you can think about your long-term memory being like any of these memory devices. I threw in a floppy disk and a CD-ROM just to be, antiquated, since we're talking about old-timey computers. The ones that Atkinson and Shiffrin were talking about were even more antiquated than these. But so you can kind of think about, if you've got it on your flash drive as a long-term memory storage, you can always retrieve it back onto not only the working memory on your computer, but on the working memory of other computers, right? Which is kind of nice. So think about those as kind of your model of how Atkinson and Shiffrin thought information moved among these three boxes of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. All right. So now we're going to call it psychology AD, which is going to be after the decline of behaviorism. Behaviorism started really to slide after 1960, but it hung on. I mean, I entered graduate school in 1988, and there were still, a lot of behavioristic questions being asked. And honestly, I think today there are still some very purely behavioristic labs going on and stuff. So it's the decline of behaviorism. It isn't completely gone. Behaviorism provided the methods that are still used in cognitive psychology. I mean, most cognitive psychologists, while we do study what's going on inside of the mind, the mental processes and stuff, we try as hard as we can to have very behavioristic techniques so that we're making sure that we aren't drawing incorrect conclusions about what's going on inside the head, right? So we try to make the methods as behavioristic as possible. So we can do things like, if we want to find out how long it takes the mind to process a particular kind of problem, we can use reaction time as a measure of processing time. So there's going to be some error in that, because from the time that the stimulus is introduced, there's going to be some processing time then added onto that. And then the person who has been processing the problem has to push a button to say that they're done or something like that. And so you're going to have that little error at the beginning and the end, which is the presentation time and the reaction time at the end. But it implies processing time, right? It implies how long it took the person to solve the problem. Cognitive psychologists tend to use a lot of experiments in their research, as opposed to other research methods like surveys, interviews, that class of asking the person what they think, or observations, where you don't have a lot of control over inputs and things like that. So cognitive psychologists tend to do a lot of research in a lab with a lot of control. We tend to, in cognitive psychology, look at humans as active, right? That they are seeking information. They want to understand how the world works. They don't just passively react to their environment the way behaviorists looked at subjects, right? We see humans as trying to figure out problems, trying to figure out what this study's about. Those kinds of things we actually see as an advantage. And so just sort of this different perspective between behaviorists and cognitivists about how to view the participants. So connectionism, neural networks. Connectionism is it's actually a philosophical term that refers to things being interconnected. In the case of philosophy, they're talking about ideas being interconnected. In psychology, we're talking about ideas in your head being connected. And that leads us very naturally into the concept of neural networks. So if you imagine each of these dots being an element of an idea or a thought or a concept, like a little part of it. Let's think of a concept of dog. Okay, so each node in there, or each of those dots, may represent a detail about a dog. Like it might have fur, 4 legs, floppy ears, bark, whatever, a bunch of things, right? Each of those little details are all related to the concept of dog, and we have neural networks where these little nodes are all interconnected, and you have like really strong associations between those nodes that are really relevant to each other, and less strong ones. You can see like really bold arrows there for the things that are really strongly associated with each other, weaker arrows for the ones that are tangentially kind of related to each other, things like that. In your brain, you have billions of neurons. When I was an undergraduate, one of my professor said, we have more neurons than there are grains of sand on the beach. And I'm like, what beach? I don't know how many grains. How deep does the sand even go? I have no idea this analogy. All I can tell you is that you've got billions of neurons. I can't imagine how to even depict how many neurons that is, right? Like that's a lot of neurons, and they're all interconnected in different ways, right? They aren't all connected to each other, but they are interconnected. And so you might have, let's say your concept of dog, it has 4 legs, is probably interconnected with your concept of cat and with your concept of cow and your concept of anything that has 4 legs, right? By that one node, 4-legged. So they are connected, but then they also have their separate parts where, the dog is going to have bark as a unique node, different from cat, different from cow, right? So while they are interconnected, and thinking about a dog might make you inadvertently think of a cow, there are also things in there, separations that'll allow you to recognize the thing you are looking for versus the things that you aren't. So your cognitions, your thoughts, are a function of activating the nodes that you need for whatever thought you're trying to have, or whatever memory you're trying to retrieve, or whatever idea you're trying to generate. So that pattern of node activation is going to determine your unique thoughts. And, the idea that you would generate the exact same activation more than once, it's probably unlikely, right? The next time you think the exact same thought, you may pull in a new detail that includes the last time you thought of the thought, right? So maybe context from that might now be part of your memory. So the point I'm trying to make is that you're very flexible, right? And every time you think about something, you think about it a little bit differently. One of the things we now know, I showed you those 3 different models of how we might process information. We now know that actually processing occurs in parallel, and especially you can have processing in different kinds of realms going on very parallel. Like, for example, your ability to read a book, understand the words, think maybe some related thoughts to what you're reading at the moment and stuff like that, can run completely in parallel to you trying to track to listen for when the oven timer goes off to let you know that the cookies are done, right? Like you can do both of those things completely in parallel. And we now know that you have a lot of parallel processing that you can do. It's not perfect. We're going to talk a lot about the difficulties of attempting to truly multitask with 2 tasks that are very similar to each other. Like that doesn't work very well, but there is a lot of processing that occurs in parallel. All right, I'm going to take a little peek at where I am. Yes, I'm on the last slide. So I'm going to finish this up and talk about cognitive neuroscience. So cognitive neuroscience really focuses in on the brain structures that underlie specific functions. Cognitive neuroscience also talks about neurotransmitters and the chemicals as well, but that you could kind of construe as being related to the brain structures. So the kinds of things that they study have to do with, for example, brain lesions. Here's a person who has had a stroke and had part of their brain damaged as a function. And so that person, while they were alive, was probably displaying some symptoms. Given the location of this stroke, I would argue that they probably had some difficulty with understanding spoken language. So brain lesions can give us some insight into what the different areas of the brain do when we see a person who's had some kind of injury, and then while they're alive, they're displaying certain deficits, shortcomings, or in some cases, elevated behavior. They're doing something else better, and that gives us some insight into what the regions do. fMRIs are used on people who are alive, which is a real benefit of the fMRI over studying brain lesions, but oftentimes a very healthy brain. And we can put you into an MRI with some tracers that have been injected so that we can use the computer to colorize the parts of the brain that are more active during the task. And so we can assign you a task to do while you're in the MRI, or we can have you read something or retrieve a memory or have you do something, and the parts of the brain that are more active we'll assume are involved in processing that information. Now, something that's really important to remember about fMRI studies is, seeing this picture makes you think, okay, well, the blue areas are probably active in whatever we're doing, right? We have to be really, really careful about drawing too strong of inferences about what that means that those areas are lit up. When we do fMRIs, most of the brain is active during the fMRI. Your brain tends to pass information along, different thoughts occur, all sorts of things are going on while in an MRI that reveal that in your everyday life, you're using a lot of your brain all the time. So what the computer does is it tries to sort out the noise, the activity that's going on in the brain that seems, random across participants, and tries to find the patterns of what is consistently active across the participants. And so it's better, right, than just sort of guessing, but it's not completely clear that we know why exactly the areas are lit up. They could be secondary areas. They could be the primary area of processing. We just don't know yet. EEGs are used. EEGs are electroencephalograms. ERP, or as we like to call them, ERPs, are when we give you a task to do, and then we want to look at that evoked response potential that occurs in response to that task that you were assigned to do. So it's an EEG process, but we have done it on purpose, asked you to do something or whatever. EEGs are a little less precise than fMRIs because these, you can see each white dot on that cap is collecting information from the neurons below it. And so there's this whole area of the brain that's being collected by a single node on that EEG. So it's not as precise as an fMRI, a lot less expensive to administer, a lot less invasive to administer, and so a lot more common in psychology research. But again, we have to be really super careful about drawing too big of conclusions from any of these kinds of neuroscientific studies because we don't know exactly what's going on. We're kind of guessing. But isn't that the whole field of psychology, of cognitive psychology, right? Is that we're kind of inferring stuff. So this is the basic background of cognitive psychology. I will join you back here for chapter 2, and we will move on with our subject. So thank you for joining me.